I'll be showing you how to sew a button by hand, how to sew a button with a machine, how to use your buttonhole foot, how to sew a shank button, how to sew a buttonhole with and without a buttonhole foot, how to draft a button placket sewing pattern, and how to sew a button placket to your clothes. There are so many types of buttons: snap buttons, toggle buttons, rivet buttons, and the list goes on. But I'll be focusing on flat buttons and shank buttons. This is a flat button, and they're usually seen with 2 or 4 holes, but it's definitely possible to see them with 3 holes or even 5 or more holes. This is a shank button, which is a button with a loop or shank on the back for sewing. Like flat buttons, shank buttons can also be found in different styles. How to sew a flat button by hand. I start by threading my needle, lining up the end of both pieces of thread, and then tying a knot. With the right side of the fabric facing up, I slide my needle through the fabric 2 times. Then I take my flat button and I slide the needle through one of the holes, and I pull the button down to the bottom of the thread so that it's close to the fabric. Then I place a toothpick under the button so that it's not sitting too close or too tightly on the fabric. Then I slide my needle through another hole in the button. The order that you choose to thread your buttonholes is up to you. And then I bring the needle back up through that same hole and then back into the first hole. I go back and forth between these 2 holes for extra security before moving on to the remaining holes. After that, I remove the toothpick and I send my needle through one of the holes to the back of the button without going through the fabric. Then I wrap my thread around the threads that are under the button. I do this a few times, and then I slide my needle through the threads under the button, slowly pulling the needle until a loop is created, and then I slide my needle through the loop, and I repeat this step once more, creating a loop with the thread, and then I cut the thread where the knot is. I'll also show how I sew a flat button with a sewing machine, but first let's look at how to sew a shank button by hand. As far as I know, shank buttons can only be sewn by hand. After I've threaded my needle and tied a knot at the end, I start with the right side of the fabric facing up, and I push my needle through the fabric 2 times. After that, I slide my needle through the hole of the shank button and I send it through the fabric, pulling the thread to make sure that the shank of the button touches the fabric. Then I send the needle through the shank of the button and back through the fabric, and I repeat this about 4 to 5 times. After that, I slide my needle through the threads near the shank, and I repeat this about 3 times. Then I create a loop, and I put my needle through the loop and pull the thread to form a knot. I do this once more for extra security, creating a loop by slowly pulling the needle, and then I cut the thread close to where the knot is. How to sew a button with a sewing machine. If your sewing machine came with a buttonhole foot, then it should also have a button foot, which looks something like this, and you should also have a darning plate. So this is the front of the darning plate, and this is the back, and you'll know it's the back because you have these 2 circular dots, and those circular dots need to go inside of these 2 holes on the Singer sewing machine. And for this hole, it should cover this hole right here. And then the bobbin thread, which is the bottom thread, should go through the back of the darning plate, through that hole, and then be pulled through up to the front. And then those 2 holes on the back of the darning plate should snap into the 2 holes on the needle plate. Gently turn your hand wheel to see if your needle goes through that hole in the darning plate. If it hits the plastic of the darning plate, then you've installed it incorrectly, which means you'll need to take off the plate and rotate it, and then snap the dots back into the holes, and then turn your wheel and you'll see that the needle goes straight through the hole. This is correct. I removed the standard foot and I replaced it with the button foot. I set my stitches to a zigzag stitch, and since I'm using a darning plate, it really doesn't matter which stitch length I use because the feed dogs are covered. Your stitch width will depend on the size of your button. When I lower the hand wheel down into the first hole, the needle goes through, but then when I lower it down into the second hole, it hits the button. So that means I need to make the stitch width wider, so a higher number, so that when I move the needle over to the first hole, it goes down through the hole, and then again when I move the needle over to the second hole, it also goes down through that hole. Once I've selected my stitch width, then I go ahead and do a handful of stitches back and forth. To secure my stitches, I set my machine to a straight stitch and did a few stitches. And then I trimmed off the excess threads. If you want to sew the other 2 empty holes, you would rotate your button and repeat the previous steps. How to make a button placket sewing pattern. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing is I'm starting with a clean copy of my front pattern block for the blouse that I'll eventually be making. And then from there, I'm going to decide which button I want to use. And once I decide which button I want to use, I'm then measuring the button. So the button that I'm going to be using is 1 inch. I wanted to show you guys that my pattern has seam allowance along the bottom, the side, the armhole, the shoulder, and the neckline, but there's no seam allowance along the center front. From the center front line, I measured and marked 1.25 inches, and my button is 1 inch wide, but I wanted my button to have some extra space on the placket, so I added the 1/4 inch. But you can decide how wide you want your button placket to be. So starting from the line that I just drew, I'm going to create a second column that's the same width as this first column, which for me is 1.25 inches. So I measured and marked 1.25 inches, and then I'm just going to extend that mark all the way down to the full length of the center front of the pattern. Then I connected the top of the 2 vertical lines to the rest of the pattern, and I also connected the seam allowance line as well. And I did that for both the top and the bottom of the vertical lines. At this point, I have seam allowance all along the neckline, the shoulder, the side, and the bottom. So I'm just adding a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the side of the button placket, like so. You could leave your button placket pattern like this, or if you wanted, you could separate the button placket by cutting down the center front line like this, and then you have a separate button placket piece, but you'd have to remember to add seam allowance to the center front and then seam allowance to the cut side of the button placket. Now I'm going to make the buttonholes to add to the pattern. Since the diameter of my button is 1 inch, I'm going to add a 1/4 inch, making my buttonhole 1.25 inches long. The next thing I have to calculate is the combined length of all of the buttonholes. So since I have 4 buttonholes, that would be 4 times 1.25 each, so the combined length is 5 inches for me. Now I have to calculate the leftover placket space, and in order to do that, I start with measuring the full length of my placket, excluding seam allowance, so that for me is 9 inches. Then I'm going to take that 9 inches and subtract 5 inches because 5 inches is the combined length of all of my buttonholes. So my remaining placket space is 4 inches. The final thing that I'll need to calculate is how much space I'll need to put between each buttonhole marking. And this is what I mean by the number of spaces between the buttons. And this is the most important calculation. If you don't want to do the calculations, you can use a sewing gauge to more quickly and accurately measure the buttonhole spaces. To make the buttonhole markings, I started by finding the midpoint on the first buttonhole column, and I did this by folding my measuring tape in half where the first column is, and then making a mark where the fold of the measuring tape is. And then I repeated this step along the middle and the bottom of the first column. And this is what my 3 marks looked like. Then I took my ruler and I lined it up along the marks that I made and then drew a straight line to connect the 3 marks. And the line that I made is very light because I'm going to be erasing some parts of the line. Then slightly below the seam allowance line, I made a small horizontal mark, and this will be where the start of the buttonhole is. And then I erased all parts of the buttonhole line above this horizontal mark that I just made. Then starting at that horizontal mark that I just made, I measured 1.25 inches, which is the length of my buttonhole, and then I made another small horizontal mark along that 1.25 inch measurement. And then I just darkened that 1.25 inch line, and this is what the first buttonhole looks like. Starting from that second horizontal mark, I measured my button spacing measurement, which was 1.3 inches. Honestly, I'm not sure where 1.3 inches would be on a measuring tape, so I just guesstimated and made a mark near the 3/8 line. So starting from the previous mark, I measured 1.25 inches, which is the length of my buttonhole, and then I made another small horizontal mark, and then I basically just darkened the buttonhole line between those 2 marks with a vertical line like so. And so that I wouldn't get confused, I erased the draft buttonhole line between the 2 buttonhole marks that I just made. After that, I just repeated these steps in order to create the rest of the buttonholes. And then I labeled my pattern like so. Usually when you make something with buttons, you'd have to cut 2 pieces. So one piece would have just the buttonhole markings, and then another pattern piece would have just the buttonhole placement, which are the circled X's. How to make a buttonhole with a buttonhole foot. My Singer sewing machine came with this buttonhole foot, and I found it in this secret drawer of my machine. So you should check your machine to see if it also comes with a free buttonhole foot as well. Your buttonhole foot may look like one of these, but I'll be talking about this one since this is what mine looks like. In case you're wondering, the correct way to hold the foot is like this, and what helps me to remember is if you see the letter B on your foot, you just want to make sure that the B is facing the correct way. When the foot is upside down, you can see that the B is backwards, and we don't want that. So this little dot right here represents where the center of the buttonhole will be, so I like to line it up with this line here. So these red lines on the foot measure the length of the buttonhole, and with this foot, the longest buttonhole that I can create is about 1.25 inches. I transferred my buttonhole onto some scrap muslin fabric by using carbon tracing paper to transfer the pattern. Then I switched out my standard presser foot for the buttonhole foot. For the sewing machine settings, I left my tension at the normal setting, which is a little under 4. The width is 5, and then for the length, I set it to this knob. The closer it is to 0, the closer together your stitches will be, and the closer it is to 1, the farther apart your stitches will be. Your sewing machine may either have a 1-step buttonhole or a 4-step buttonhole. With a 1-step buttonhole, it basically means you press one button and your sewing machine will create the whole entire buttonhole in just 1 step. Whereas with a 4-step buttonhole, given that a buttonhole is basically a rectangle with 4 sides, if your sewing machine has a 4-step buttonhole, it means that your machine will sew one side of the buttonhole at a time for a total of 4 steps. My machine has a 4-step buttonhole, so I'll be sharing the process for that. This is the first setting for the 4-step buttonhole installation. Then I checked to make sure that these 3 marks were all lining up. and I lined up the top of my pattern to those 3 marks. Then I made sure that this center line was lining up with this little part of the foot. Because my buttonhole is the full length of the foot, I was able to let the slider go all the way down to the bottom of the foot. But if your buttonhole is shorter, you may have to manually stop stitching before you get to the end of the foot. Then I changed my machine setting to the 2-4 stitch, which basically is the horizontal stitch, and I did about 4 stitches back and forth before stopping. And then I switched over to setting number 3, which is a vertical stitch that goes upward. Not gonna lie, I was struggling to keep the fabric straight, but you get the general idea. And then I changed my settings back to the 2-4 dial, which will basically do a horizontal stitch back and forth, and I did about 4 or 5 stitches. Then I placed the pin at the top and the bottom of the buttonhole. I used the seam ripper to cut down the center of the buttonhole, and then I removed the pins, and then I tested to see if the button fits in the hole, and it's a fit. Here's how to sew a buttonhole without a buttonhole foot. The good news is that with your standard presser foot, you can follow the previous steps as if you had a buttonhole foot installed, and the bonus is that with using a standard foot, you can make your buttonhole any length because there isn't the limit that the slider on the buttonhole foot creates. How to sew a button placket to a garment. I started by tracing and cutting out my pattern pieces. If your button placket is already included in your front bodice pattern as one piece, you can skip the next step. But if you have a separate button placket piece like this, then you can start by cutting a matching interfacing piece for the placket. I don't have interfacing, so I used this pattern fabric to represent the interfacing. I put my placket on top of the edge of the front bodice piece with right sides facing, and then I straight stitched along the seam allowance line, and now I have one pattern piece. Then I trimmed off some of the fabric along the seam allowance so that about 3/8 of an inch of fabric was left. And then with the fabric wrong side up, I pressed the seam allowance fabric towards the other edge of the front placket. Next, I folded and pressed the edge of the placket along the seam allowance. If your seam allowance is more than 3/8 of an inch, you can trim it down so that it's 3/8 of an inch. Otherwise, leave it as is. Then I turned the fabric right side facing up, and I folded the placket so that the folded edge was at the very top. Then I straight stitched along the seam allowance line at the bottom of my shirt, and it looked like this. After that, I trimmed the fabric below the stitches, leaving about 1/4 of an inch of fabric to prevent bulking. And I stopped cutting where the folded edge of the placket connects with the bodice. Then I flipped the placket right side out by pushing in the wrong side of the fabric until only the right sides of the placket were showing. With the fabric wrong side up, I placed the folded edge of the placket on top of the seam allowance line and pressed it down to keep it flat. And then I hand stitched a horizontal basting stitch along the seam allowance line at the top of the placket. Before this next step, the shirt should have the neckband and the collar attached and be pretty much assembled, so we'll pretend that that's the case. Next, I'll edge stitch around all edges of the placket. Then I'll repeat the previous steps for the other front bodice piece. We'll need 2 plackets, one for the buttons and one for the buttonholes. Once the placket is sewn onto both bodice pieces, the next thing to do is transfer the marks for the buttons and the buttonholes, and then install the buttons and the buttonholes. Another thing to know about buttons is that you can make something like this. Watch this video to see how I made it.